Thank you so much for having us here this morning. I really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about the work we do. Good morning, Bill. Good to see you back there. As we get started, as Alan mentioned, the Child Advocacy Center does do a lot of work in the child abuse and neglect field. So some of this morning's conversation might be a little bit uncomfortable. We're not going to get into gory details, but if you do have a trauma history, some of it may be a little bit triggering, so please practice self-care as you may need to. And we're just going to dive right in. There we go. So the Child Advocacy Center actually provides services across 14 counties in southern Missouri. We have a location here in Springfield, a cozy little house on Walnut Street, but we also have a location down in West Plains, and that allows children and families and the team members that we work with to access our centers readily, easily. Whoa, it's a Tuesday morning. And so this really just helps make getting to the centers more accessible for everybody. Our mission encompasses both the investigation components that we work with, as well as providing advocacy and support services for children and families so they can begin their healing journey, and our outreach and community education and training programs, where we're really trying to work out in our communities to not be needed as much by reducing the rates of child victimization that we see. Before we talk a little more about the services specifically that the CAC provides, we think it's really helpful for everybody in the community to just understand a few basic facts about what child abuse and neglect looks like. The CDC finds that 1 in 7 children are abused or neglected in the United States in any given year. That's a pretty startling number. Neglect is a big component of that, but with all of the different types of victimization we see, there is a range of severity that comes with each of these types of maltreatment. A more startling statistic is that 1 in 10 children in the United States will be sexually abused before their 18th birthday. And what goes along with that is that 90% of the time, those children know, love, or trust the person that is harming them. And that's an important piece to understand when we dig a little deeper into why it is hard for children to talk about what's happened to them, why they're not able to ask for help early on. When that is happening from somebody you know, love, and trust, it can be very, very hard to speak out and ask for help. And all of this kind of sets up why the Child Advocacy Center exists within our community. We also find that 1 in 7 children are receiving some type of sexual solicitation online. This is a growing number and a very scary part of our world for children as we give them more and more access to technology and digital communication that just makes the door for perpetration wider and wider and the risk greater and greater. As Alan so beautifully mentioned at the beginning, when we're investigating child abuse and neglect within this community, there is a multidisciplinary team response to those investigations. The CAC does not do this alone, but what is often surprising for people is how many different agencies do get involved in these cases. You're going to have Children's Division, who are there to ensure safety for the child and figure out what supportive services that family may need. And their goal is to try to keep that family intact wherever possible. We want to ensure safety, but we want to try and keep our families together. You also have law enforcement involvement, and law enforcement is looking again at safety for the child, but they're also looking to determine if a crime was committed. So already we have 2 different agencies basically investigating the same sort of circumstances, just with slightly different goals and outcomes. As the case further unfolds, then the juvenile office may get involved if a child does need to be taken into protective custody. And then you get all of the advocates, the interviewers, medical personnel, mental health personnel, all start to get involved if we do have criminal prosecution. You also now have a prosecuting attorney's office involved as well. What this creates is a really messy, muddy system that is very overwhelming for a child and their non-offending caregiver to navigate. And when you don't have a CAC in your community, what ends up happening is this child and this family may meet multiple times with all these different agencies being asked very similar questions, being asked to retell what happened. And that adds trauma to the child in having to recount that. It also makes for what can appear to be very inconsistent statements from children, because children will answer a question based on how it's framed for them. So if one detective asks it one way and a different investigator asks the question a slightly different way, it may start to seem like the child's statement is inconsistent. And it's really just we don't understand appropriately how to frame questions for children. When we look at the range of victimization that we're seeing, we're talking about everything from physical abuse to sexual abuse to exploitation to trafficking to children who are in drug endangered environments. A while back, meth was a big concern. Fentanyl exposure now for children, and particularly small children, is of great concern because I can't say the word. It is so fatal and dangerous, and for such a minimal exposure. But there we go, we're finding it. We also get into medical neglect, educational neglect, emotional abuse, as well as children who are growing up in domestic violence situations where they may not be directly targeted by the violence, but they're surrounded in it in their daily life. So these are all the different types of victimization and maltreatment that our children are experiencing within our community. And how you go about investigating each one of those can be a little bit different because there's so many different dynamics and factors. It also kind of helps us understand a little bit why prevention and reduction of child abuse is so complicated, because risk factors for neglect are different than risk factors for sexual abuse, which can be different than risk factors for physical abuse. And then there's a whole bunch that overlap. So it's just a very complicated situation. And this is why the CAC sits in the middle, is to try to decomplicate it as much as we possibly can and try to make it as supportive for those children and families as we possibly can. So our services, there's a few of them. Our advocates are working with that child and their non-offending caregiver to help with safety and then help stabilize and get them on the path to healing. So they may be looking at other community resources that we want to connect children and families with so they can continue on that journey. Each scenario and each situation is a little bit different. Sometimes the perpetrator is the in-home primary breadwinner. So as that person is removed from the home to keep the child safe, you now have to figure out how to restabilize an entire family. So each one's a little bit different, but our advocates work for as long as necessary alongside that child and family to get them that stability and also to help them understand the next steps of what's going on in the process, depending upon where their case is headed. Our forensic interviews is really the heart and soul of what happens at the CAC, and that is that one-on-one conversation that happens between the child and the CAC forensic interviewer. And so the forensic interviewer is trained in a protocol that really helps them sit with that child and walk through what has happened to that child. These are not easy conversations because what they're really having to try to help the child share is some very explicit details around what has happened. Prosecution needs to know the difference between rape and sodomy if they're going to prosecute charges, and the only way we can make that determination is by some pretty explicit information that a child has to share. And so this is a very difficult position for them to be in. It is not necessarily a therapeutic process for the child. It's not like therapy. But by having them come to the CAC means they're able to have that conversation in an environment that is set up to be supportive for them, to help them feel safe, and that those conversations are conducted by highly trained interviewers so that we can make it as palatable and as easy for the child as possible. The interview is videotaped and the investigative team are on site and they watch from an observation room in real time, so that the people who are taking the next steps in this case are there, they're hearing the information. But again, the child now isn't having to talk to 3 different adults. They talk to one, all of the rest of the adults are listening. And the interviewer wears an earpiece, so if the investigative team has follow-up questions that they'd like the interviewer to ask, they can speak right into the interviewer's ear. So all of this helps just make what is a very difficult process a tiny bit easier for a child and reduces the number of times they have to go through that experience. We also have medical on site, so when the child is done with their forensic interview, they can get a full checkup with our nurse practitioners. It's much like a child wellness checkup, but they will also document any injuries or markings on the child's body. They will also do a genital examination if there are concerns of sexual abuse, so that we can again ensure that the child's body is safe and healthy, and look for any potential evidence that they may be there to help substantiate and support whether this child has been abused or not. People are generally shocked to find out that 90% of the time there are no physical findings, even on our sexual assault cases, and that is because delayed disclosure is a big part of the challenge that children face in overcoming and being able to seek help. Rarely do they get help the very first time something has happened. And if you think about when you bite the inside of your cheek, how quickly that mouth sore heals, that is how children's bodies heal. So very rarely is there physical evidence to support what has happened to the child, which makes their statement in the forensic interview even more important, because out of that process, we have to get enough details that you can understand what happened and that an adult can understand that this child's statement is in fact credible. We also then work closely with other community partners, primarily the Victim Center, to get these kiddos into mental health services so that they can begin that healing journey. We triage children for trauma symptoms and try to make sure that they're getting into trauma-focused mental health services, and also do work to ensure that their caregivers are understanding of what their process looks like, and recognizing that a non-offending caregiver is also going through their own trauma once they realize their child has been harmed. And so we're there to support those caregivers in their healing journey as well. The single most important factor to a child's recovery from a traumatic experience, particularly abuse and neglect, is a supportive and believing caregiver who will walk through them through all of those steps towards healing, because sometimes they're not easy days. Outside of all of that, we then help facilitate the information within the MDT teams that we work with. Serving 14 counties means there are 14 different multidisciplinary teams that we coordinate, because each county has its own juvenile office, its own children's division circuit. There are different law enforcement agencies in each of those counties. And we really try to help all of those different partners communicate well, collaborate on the cases that they're working, make sure that we're sharing information timely and appropriately, with the intention of making sure that these children aren't falling through the system gaps because you have so many different agencies at play. We facilitate each month a case review in each one of those counties, and that's where the entire investigative team comes together and we talk through all of our open cases and we give updates on where we're at, determine next steps that may need to happen to keep that child moving towards safety and healing. Then outside of the house, because we don't have enough to do, we really then get into our community education and prevention programming. And that's a lot like things like this morning, going out in the community, helping raise awareness about the issues and the work that we do, as well as working with teams on specific trainings around different maltreatment types and responses, working with a lot of adults who work with children, helping make sure they understand their responsibility as a mandated reporter, how to identify signs and symptoms that a child may be in risk, what to do if a child does start to make a disclosure to you, much like we practice fire drills at school. When a child starts to make that first outcry, they're often very tentative. And so the first adult that receives that outcry needs to be ready to receive that information and know how to respond, because if the adult receiving that information initially has a poor reaction, that child is likely to shut back down and stop their disclosure process. And so we want adults who work with children regularly to really be ready for those situations. We're also doing a lot of work out in the schools with both teachers and children. Preventing child abuse is not a child's responsibility. It is ours as the adult community's responsibility to step up, but we also recognize that our children need to feel empowered to seek help. And sometimes children grow up knowing that no different, not knowing that what is happening to them is not normal and is not okay, because that may be all they've known for their entire lives. We do a lot. To help you understand a little bit of the scope of our work, in 2023, we provided services to 1,563 children across our 14 counties. 629 of them resided in Greene County. That's just in 2023. And you can see with our numbers for our training and outreach, we're making a big impact out in the community, training and connecting with over 6,000 community members just in 2023 alone. So our calling here is big, our work is hard, but we do have hope, and that is the biggest reason we're out here, because this can feel overwhelming and it can feel horrible, but we do know we can make it better, and that is where you all as adults and community leaders play a big role in helping us make it better. Talking about it is one big part of it. Child abuse exists in the shadows, and they're uncomfortable conversations, and the more we're unwilling to have those conversations, the more it thrives in the shadows. We need to talk to our children about safety and body autonomy, and we don't start those conversations when they're 12 and 13. We start those conversations at 2 and 3. When we're teaching them body part names, teach them all the correct body part names. Penis and vagina are not bad words, but they're very important words if a child is making a disclosure and they're using a name that's a made up or a cutesy name because adults are uncomfortable with those words. Those disclosures can get missed, or those initial outcries can be overlooked when we're talking about a bunny or a cookie, things like that. We need to teach our children autonomy and help model that for them from very early on. No one touches them without permission, and that includes showing up to a family Thanksgiving dinner and asking your child to hug Uncle Bob, who maybe they've only met once or twice in their life. They're uncomfortable by that, but we force them to break through that sense of discomfort and make that hug, rather than allowing them to sit in their natural instinct of, this doesn't feel right for me, and it should be okay for me to say no. I don't want to hug you even at 2 and 3. Those little tiny things help empower our children, help set norms for them, so that when things do happen, when those early boundary breaking actions happen, they recognize that this isn't normal and they may seek help sooner. My child used to yell every time we were backing out of the driveway if her seatbelt wasn't on. That's what I want for all of our children. If someone is starting to groom them, if someone is starting to harm them in a way that they feel so clear that this is not normal and this is not safe, that they can yell from the back seat, stop. Please empower and support our law enforcement and our social service workers. These are tough, tough jobs, and they need our support on a daily basis. And the biggest part is more about what you're doing today, learning about what's happening so that we can report it, so that we can make things better for our children. There are a lot of different training opportunities that the CAC has across a range of different segments within our community, from those who are leading organizations and our awareness to action, which can focus in on policy and safety within a building. Also getting into trainings for adults who work with children on how to interact with them in a healthy way. But the best one for people who are feeling really, really overwhelmed right now is our Stewards of Children training. This is a 3-hour training. We offer it pretty regularly. We've got one coming up on September 11th via Zoom. And this is just an introduction to understanding more about child abuse, helping adults recognize 5 simple safety boundaries to put in place, and also helping build your own sense of empowerment, that if you do find yourself in a situation where you need to advocate for a child, where you need to step up and make a hotline report, that you feel comfortable in doing so. So I encourage everybody to join us on September 11th. It is a free training, but the link here on the QR code also takes you to our website, where you'll see a list of other dates that are upcoming after September 11th. Lastly, one of the other ways you can help is through our different volunteer opportunities, from blanket making to service projects around our campus to supply drives. Kids eat a lot of snacks when they come through the CAC, and so little things like that as a nonprofit organization help us sustain those services and just make sure that every kid coming through the center has a good time to the extent that we can while they're there. We do have a number of special events throughout the year. Our funnest one, I think, is coming up September 14th, our Burgers and Cheers event. That's at Wire Road this year. Tickets are on sale, so we'd love for you to come out and have a good time with us and help us raise some money to continue to support the work that we do. So I've just talked a million miles a minute and thrown a lot of information out to you. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
So, Kat, thank you for what you and Erica and the team does for the youth of our community. It's such an important role. I know that Greene County unfortunately has a little bit higher rate of child neglect and abuse. And I'm wondering if you're seeing trends that's starting to turn that around just a bit.
We see the trend a little bit. And one of the things I like to point out when we start talking about numbers and rates of child abuse, a lot of the rates, particularly when we drill down to a county or city level, come from reports being made. So I want to flip your thought around it a little bit, that sometimes having a higher rate of reported child abuse doesn't necessarily mean you have more abuse happening in your community, but it may indicate that your response system and your community awareness and education is stronger. And so you have a community who's willing to make those steps to help protect children. I think that is a big part. We do. We have the largest CAC in the state. We see more children in a year than our partner centers in St. Louis or Kansas City. Do I think Greene County, Springfield has more child abuse than Kansas City or St. Louis? No, I think through many, many years of work, we've developed a really strong and robust response system that is helping us find these children and put in appropriate intervention.
I appreciate that distinction because that's really important to identify, is that the reporting is higher, not necessarily the abuse and neglect is higher.
Correct.
Great, thank you.
Welcome. Any other questions? Yes.
Are you overwhelmed?
Am I overwhelmed? Most days, yes. It can feel very overwhelming. And I often ask our staff, okay, these days are hard. This problem feels insurmountable at some days. So how do we do it? How do we keep going? And we have to come back down to, for that child in that moment, we made a difference. And we have to do a lot of our work in trust and faith that the ripple effect will continue. And if we can get this child into healing, hopefully we can break their generational cycle of abuse and make it a little bit better going forward. But yes, it does feel overwhelming at times.
So there were over 600 children helped in Greene County in 2023.
Yes.
How many were you able to have? Do you have a measurement of that? Or only the reported cases that you were in?
It's the reported cases. We operate through a referral system, meaning Children's Division, law enforcement, prosecuting attorney, and occasionally the juvenile office are the ones bringing the referral for a child to be seen to the CAC. The only reasons we will ever say no to any of those referrals is if perhaps the child has already been interviewed around the same incident and there's nothing new to have them go through that again, or if there's a conflict. Other than that, we operate much like an ER. We will not say no, we will not turn away, and we are working very hard to make sure that the wait time between the referral and the child being seen stays under 5 days. Any emergent case that comes in, which means there's an immediate safety concern for the child or the child has injuries, things where there is a timeliness, we will see the same day or within 24 hours. Even if that means our staff is staying into the evening or working weekends to be there for those children.
Follow-up question.
Yep.
Was it difficult to get all the different agencies to buy into the
multidisciplinary team? Bill Prince was actually around when that got going. I've only been with the center for 3 years. I think The center's movement starting came from a community response. The Greene County Medical Society, along with people like Bill, prosecuting attorneys' offices, were just realizing that these cases are really hard. It's unnecessarily traumatic for children. Is there a better way to do it? And so it really got started from a community-led place, along with those key stakeholders who were working these cases, who all want to do right by kids. So I would say there were some bumps along the way. Getting everyone to play well in the sandbox together can be challenging at times, but we are really unified in knowing that this is what is in the best interest of their kids in our community. Any other questions? Please feel free to come by. We have some little postcards up front. We do offer an open house once a month where you can come in and actually tour the center. It is a 7:30 a.m. start so that we can have that done before children come into the center. Obviously, when we have children and families on site, protecting their privacy and confidentiality is a big part of what we do. So we have limited windows when we can open up the center. But coming in and seeing the space can also help you just better understand that while it sounds traumatic and it sounds difficult for children, there is a lot that is done to help them feel safe and supported through this process. Yes. Fantastic. Lastly, here's how you can stay connected with us. Kind of coming back to one of those simple ways you can help is simply following our different social media platforms, sharing, liking, and commenting, and that just helps us continue to get the word out across our community. Thank you so much for having us here today.